Hello. Good morning, welcome everyone, and good afternoon for those who are in Europe. Francesco Cavatorta is my name. I'm a professor of political science at Laval University in Canada, and I am delighted to be moderating today's discussion on the future of political Islam in North Africa with some of the best scholars of the region. Before I introduce the panelists, let me just say that this event is held in the framework of the 8th edition of the Rome Med Dialogues, which will take place in Rome from the 1st to the 3rd of December 2022. And that I also would like to thank ISPI for organizing this really interesting discussion. I will briefly introduce the four panelists because we only have 1 hour and we would like to actually get to the heart of the matter as quickly as possible. The four panelists for today are Youssef Sharif, who is the director of the Columbia Global Center in Tunis, Intisar Fakir, who's senior fellow and director of North Africa and Sahel Program, Middle East Institute. Then we have Dalia Hanem, senior analyst, Middle East and North Africa region, European Union Institute for Security Studies, and the author of a forthcoming book titled Understanding the Persistence of Competitive Authoritarianism in Algeria, which will be published in September by Palgrave Macmillan. I highly recommend that you read this book because there's not that many out on Algeria, so it'll be a great contribution. And finally, we have Olivier Roy, professor and scientific advisor on the Middle East Directions Program at the European University Institute in Florence. And Professor Roy is also has a recent book out that he co-edited with Theo Blanc called Salafism, Challenged by Radicalization, Violence, Politics, and the Advent of Post-Islamism. So without further ado, let me call first on Professor Roy. We're going to start with him. The question really is about trying to have a broader understanding of the changes that might have affected Islamist parties and movement in North Africa since 2011, because we have seen Islamist movements taking on different trajectories. And to what extent, therefore, have Islamist actors in North Africa changed in response to evolving domestic, regional, and international dynamics? What experiences affected them most, and which factors we should focus on to understand current developments around political Islam? As most of you know, political Islam has experienced different trajectories in the region, and no one's better than Professor Roy to give us some sort of overview of the changes that have taken place. I give the mic to you, Professor Roy, for 5-6 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So if we look at the three countries of North Africa, which are very different due to their history and political context, we see a convergence between the Islamist parties. They all, I would say, stopped to be revolutionary. They all accepted, agreed, or just wanted to cooperate with the existing regimes or with the state structures in the framework of a coalition, or supposedly, political coalition between different parties. They all accepted the principle of the constitution, etc., etc. So they all wanted to become mainstream and to be open to alliances. They gave up references to Sharia, and also references to the concept of an Islamic state. They turn, the religious references to references to conservative values, so the defense of the national traditions, family, virtue, of course, and traditions. So they, in a word, they try to occupy the center height of the political spectrum on moral, ethical, and cultural issues, not specifically on religion. They all are liberal in economic terms, only in economic terms, but so they are no more the spokesperson for the poor, because in fact, they are more looking at the business milieu, middle classes, etc., etc. So they had a lot of international connections. For instance, Ennahda with the Muslim Brothers in the Middle East, but they are downplaying, these international connections. The PJD in Morocco even has, more or less accepted the normalization of relations between Morocco and Israel. So they are very cautious, to speak of national interest and no more to refer to pan-Islamic solidarity. So they don't want to appear, as connected with international brotherhood or with any kind of international radical movements. Their challenges, I would say that they have two main challenges. One is the existing regimes now. Because the existing regimes in the three, by existing regimes, of course, I use a very loose expression, but now in Tunisia, we can speak about a new regime. These regimes, they all also adopt the attitude of defending traditional values. So the Islamist party are no more, the parties who speak about ethics, traditions, moral, and so on. So all the regimes are using the same vocabulary and are implementing through the courts these conservative values against homosexuality, for instance, or in favor of imposing public fast during Ramadan, etc., etc. The second challenge of these parties is that they have lost, a part of their constituency, the poor, the people who want to have a state which is more active in subsidiaries, in supporting the poor classes of the society, etc. And the last challenge is that they all lost the youth. These parties are all gerontocracy. All they are in their 70s, 80s, and we don't see a new generation of the old guard. Doesn't let a new generation emerge, and change the party. So they are losing the youth, losing the poor, and have a problem to find a new identity in their shift towards the center right of mainstream politics.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Roy, for the this kind of broad overview. I would like to go to Intisar now to start talking about the specific cases. As Professor Roy mentioned, the three different countries are often, kind of bunched together, compared, and to a certain extent it makes sense, but they're also very different from each other. They have different histories, they have different political systems, different institutions. So Intisar, I'm going to come to you and to try to talk a bit about the Justice and Development Party, because the Justice and Development Party rode the wave of the Arab Spring to a certain extent, came to power for the first time, won the elections, won again, and a few years later, obviously it governed in a coalition, but then in 2021, it lost, I think, about 90% of its parliamentary seats. So it was a wipeout from an electoral perspective, and they do not seem to matter at all any longer in the politics of the country. Some people might even argue that this is kind of the death knell of political Islam in the region. It is clear now that it has been rejected by society, by voters, and by the political system more broadly. I was wondering if you can maybe link some of the issues that Professor Rob brought up and link them to the failure of the PJD to a certain extent, or the rise and fall of the PJD from 2011 to 2021.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, by the way. It's always a pleasure to be on the same panel as my colleagues, Dalia and Youssef, and of course, Professor White. It's a pleasure. But yeah, let me talk a little bit about some of the specifics, and then I think it will reinforce some of what Professor Roy said and kind of, lay out the argument that extends certainly beyond the PJD's experience. And I would just maybe start here by saying that for the PJD, I think the most important factors that kind of diminished the appeal, which then culminated in the loss of votes, as you just explained, really had to do with a couple of elements. I think it had to do first with how the party handled the pressure from the palace and from other political parties when it became clear that they were gaining a lot of support and a lot of votes. And then the second element, which I would argue is maybe even more important, is their governance record, especially during their second mandate, which was much weaker. And I will talk more a little bit about that. I would say that these two are perhaps more important than any of the other external factors. So just to kind of step back a little bit in terms of the PJD's experience, of course, they've been participating in elections since the late 90s. It's an experience that I would say was marked by two key elements. First, that the party managed to prove efficient and to value public service more than other competing political parties. Second, and based on this experience, the party had argued, I think in line with what other Islamist parties argued throughout the Middle East, is that if they come to power, they can, fix or at least hold the answer to many of the economic and social challenges that are facing Morocco. So in 2011, they ran unrestricted. They won a majority of the seats, as you explained. Of course, here it's important to also remind that Morocco's political, economic, and also social structures are all really dominated by the monarchy. But I would just note here that the palace's mandate in the aftermath of 2011 had kind of contracted a little bit, which gave the PJD a greater opportunity to act, at least for a little while. I think other political parties could have benefited from the same opening, but I would say that the PJD were certainly the ones more willing to try. So the first mandate from 2011 to 2016, I would say on the whole, their governance record was rather mixed, but they did manage to convince the voters that they could do more with a second term. And on that basis, they received a much larger number of parliamentary elections, a much larger number of seats in 2016. Before we talk a little bit about 2016, which was really sort of a key moment for the party, I just want to say a couple of things about the geopolitical dimension of the backlash that Islamists faced across the region, which I would say sort of started within a year or so of coming to power. This backlash was the result of various factors. In part, I would say it was the anti-Islamist rhetoric and efforts to undermine Islamist parties by Gulf monarchies, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, for their own political reasons, of course, but also arguably for fear that a democratic process could really produce an elected legitimate Islamist leadership, which then undermines the need for a pact, like, for example, what Assad would have in Saudi Arabia. There are other domestic elements as well here, and I don't mean to kind of diminish those. There were concerns about what having an Islamist-led political system could mean, but I would say that this is more about sort of the in-group being fearful of losing their status, which then kind of took on this shape of secularist versus Islamist divide. And of course, all of these fault lines really hardened following the coup in Egypt in 2013. So to address this, again, going back to what Professor Wah was saying, The PJD emphasized that they are an indigenous organization, not a local branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. They were still relatively new with the electorate and still quite popular. And I think some of that had to do with the leadership of Ennahda bin Kiran, who was then both head of the party and prime minister. They had to make some concessions, but I think overall they rebounded. They increased their gains in the local elections of 2015, and then again, of course, in 2016. But here, going back to the second mandate, I think that victory really, again, raised concern about their dominance among other parties in the country. And so, the parties arguably here following the monarchy's lead did not want to join a coalition that was so dominated by the PJD. The party was then divided on how to handle this. Some wanted to make concessions and cede seats in government. Others wanted to wait and really maybe even if they had to go into another election, they were convinced that they would essentially have the same showing. In the end, the more cautious wing won out. Again, here going back to what Professor Roy was explaining. So they started a second term in which the party's position was much weaker than it needed to be, which affected their ability to put through and implement an effective government program. The party internally became fractionalized. A couple of years later, of course, the pandemic comes. They were further sidelined by a royal-led response implemented largely by technocrats. Another element, I think, that contributed to the significant loss that we saw is that they did not work their base as they usually do. The business-backed RNE, the party that ultimately won the most seat, had substantially more financial resources. They run a tighter and much more grassroots and compelling campaign, something that the PJD just did not really do in this last election. So, just to kind of close out, what does all of this mean for the party? The party is now playing a very small role in the opposition. They're trying to rehabilitate their image on the national stage, on the local stage. They also need to heal the sort of intra-party divides of 2016. To address all of this, they brought back Ennahda bin Kiran as sort of a Hail Mary, so to speak. But he is really struggling to figure out just how to position himself and the party and what their selling point is going to be next. Again, here, what Professor Roy explained, if you're not going to be sort of different on the basis of your ideology, and if you're not going to be effective on what you value in terms of public service and efficiency, then how do you differentiate yourself to the electorate, particularly in a moment that I think it really has sort of, we see the appeal of traditional ideologies really receding further and further, whether they're leftists, Islamists, independence parties, etc. There is more and more interest in pragmatic, technocratic governance that promises, first of all, material well-being, and at the very least, if you cannot, effectively deliver on material well-being, at the very least, you have to deliver, effective service delivery without really a need for all of this to be wrapped up in ideological rhetoric. So I'll stop there and happy to pick up on any of these trends.
Thank you very much, Intisar, for this answer on the PJD. I'd like to move to Dalia now for another super interesting case, the case of Algeria, which is slightly different because Algeria, of course, was the first country to experience, the Islamist electoral victory already in the early 1990s. We all kind of know what happened after they won those elections. But Islamists have continued to be present on the Algerian political scene and in the political system ever since, although the feast was banned, mostly under the banner of the MSP, the Movement for Society and Peace. They run in elections, they win seats, maybe not as many as they would like, but Algeria at the same time recently has experienced, the movement to ensure the dismissal of Bouteflika, with hopes that it would finally alter the system, radically change it, maybe move again back towards genuine democratization. This has not really happened. From that, you'd kind of like to know what is the relationship between the Islamists and the Iraq. What might the future hold for the Iraq and for the Islamists trying to, at the same time, ride the wave of protest while not upsetting the state institutions that they have worked within for such a long time. So Dalia, I'll give you the mic.
Thank you, Francesco. Well, as you said, the case of Algeria is pretty particular because Algeria is one of the first to have witnessed, almost a power grab from the Islamists, but then followed the civil war that, took some 10 years of the age of this country, 150,000 deaths. And since then, I think the Algerians, as one interviewee once told me, and I keep repeating this sentence, Algerians have been vaccinated in a way against the Islamism. To a certain extent, this is true. And we've seen it in 2011 when the Islamists, including the MSP, joined forces in a coalition called AAV. And they actually, tried to surf the wave of the Arab Spring and the PJD, for instance, victory in Morocco, but also the Islamists in Egypt. And they actually failed miserably because they had even lesser seat than when the MSP was alone. But again, here we need to come back to one very important word, that is cooptation. The cooptation of the Islamists in Algeria is very strong and has been pretty successful. And that started already in 1995 in the midst of the civil war, when the Algerian regime understood that, okay, banning the FIS is okay. However, they need to play the game with the Islamists. So they wanted to present themselves as being open, inclusive, and democratic. And this is when they joined, they let the Islamists join the parliament, and they became actually a very important actor of the political arena. But the participation of the Islamists in the political game contributed to their fragmentation between those who refused any kind of cooperation with the regime and those who were willing to negotiate. And for many Islamist parties, including Francesco, the MSP, which is the Movement for Society and Peace, joining the government is in a way, in Algeria, in this very twisted, playing political field, it is the only way to preserve their very existence. It is for them the chance to play another day, to exist another day. But in a sense, by letting the Islamist, parties enter parliament politics and even participate in government coalition, let us remind here the auditors that, the Islamists had many parliamentarian seats, but also ministers in very important positions. And by doing so, the Algerian authorities have succeeded in diffusing moderate embodiment of political Islam in Algeria. On one level, the participatory approach, as Professor Roy said, robbed the Islamists, from the legitimacy in a sense. They abandoned this revolutionary idea, but many people who were, who were disappointed by the FIS had so much hope in the MSP and in other Islamists. And then by, letting them participate and enter the political arena, actually they robbed these moderates from their legitimacy in the eyes of the public, and they hindered by the same time their capacity to mobilize voters. So many citizens, and this will come back to your point with the Hirak, many citizens in Algeria see the Islamists today as being as corrupt as the regime's old guard. They see them, today they don't believe anymore in the image of religious piety and purity that the Islamists have tried, to display, nor in the spiritual utopia that they've promised them. As a matter of fact, during the Hirak in 2019, many, Islamists tried again to surf on the wave of the Hirak, and they've been actually, they've been pulled out of the demonstration in the middle of Algiers, and people call them Shiatin. Shiatin in Algerian dialect means sycophant. So this showed the extent of, their lack of legitimacy, lack of legitimacy in general. And I don't, see them at the political level because of this loss of credibility to play any important role for the Hirak, or even to try to move towards the Hirak. As a matter of fact, they moved really against the Hirak. Makri, who is the leader of the MSP, at the beginning of the crisis met in secret with the president's brother, and the deal was that they were going to give Bouteflika another year in office and then let him go. When this plot, in between quotes, became public, many Hirak members expressed their outrage, and the Makri and the MSP attempt to do some controlled damage by refusing to run in the 2019 presidential election, despite Bouteflika announcement, to not to run. But le mal était fait, if I may say. The damage was done. People already, their lack of legitimacy plus credibility, lack of credibility plus, this temptation of le pouvoir was already too much for Algerians. And of course, we've seen the MSP that, appears to have understood pretty early within the popular movement that actually it wasn't going to make a real change. There was no transition at sight, for Algeria. So they decided to change their strategy. And then we saw and we heard, the MSP leader and some of other cadres saying that, that the Hirak was actually problematic because many of the Hirakis were actually members engaged by foreign agents, foreign countries. We all can imagine who are these foreign countries. And they also said, that many of the Hirakis were members of the Franc-Maçonnerie. And so this, killed a credibility and the legitimacy that was already not there. And I will finish on that, and we can open up the discussion after that. I wrote myself about the decline of the Algerian Islamists in Algeria. But again, I think the lack of dominion on the political arena as parties does not mean that they lack dominion on the social sphere. And this is where we can talk, for instance, about the importance of Dawah Salafiyya in Algeria, because it is, a grassroots movement that proved to be very resilient, very adaptive, and despite the fact that they present themselves, Dawah Salafiyya, as quite Salafism, believe me, their voices are very loud and they are heard.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dalia. I think in the second part, we will address the questions of the presence of Islamism, let's say, outside political parties, in fact. So there's always issues here when we talk about political parties and how representative they are, in particular because they do not enjoy trust in general across the Middle East. All parties, not only the Islamist parties, because turnout at elections is very poor and very low in most countries as well. Before we get to that, I would like to get to Youssef and ask the same question, more or less, that I've asked Intisar, to maybe elaborate a bit on the fall from grace that Ennahda experienced in Tunisia from the highs of 2011, when it received 38% of the votes and became the largest party in the country, headed the Troika. And since then, at every election, it has done worse and worse. It lost in percentage points. It lost in the number of seats it had in parliament. And at the same time, it was accused of, being inefficient, incompetent, which is not something that they had experienced before. In fact, they presented themselves as efficient, competent, and able to manage the challenges that Tunisia faced. How did this happen? And in a way, how does this, in a way, I don't want to say justify, but how does the failure of Ennahda explain the rise of Sayed and the ability that he had to carry out this kind of constitutional coup with the apparent support of the vast majority of Tunisians? So, Youssef, over to you.
Thank you, Francesco. What I'm going to say is complementary to what the previous panelists say. Of course, in 2011, political Islam was seen as the future of Tunisian politics. And as the Arab uprisings accelerated, no competing groups were as organized as the Islamists of Ennahda. We see Turkey and Qatar, let's say from the international perspective, Turkey and Qatar taking a proactive role in supporting them, be it diplomatically or via their media conglomerates, Al Jazeera and so on. But also they were really popular on the ground because they were the only organized or the most organized force in the country. Nonetheless, already during 2011, there were issues that they were going to face that were there already and that they couldn't really deal with. And I'm going to mention 4 that explain why this fall from grace. The first one is what you mentioned, the what we can call the mismanagement of state resources or the mismanagement of the state. The second one is something they're not necessarily linked to, but that's the rise of violent extremism. The third reason is a strong adverse propaganda. Intisar mentioned this when she spoke. And the fourth issue that they faced or that weakened them is a strategic calculation that proved wrong. So I will start by the first challenge, that of mismanagement, because, of course, after 2011, the economic and governance problems became very, very high. And the way Ennahda dealt with these economic and governance problems was not very good. So unlike Turkey's AKP, which is credited with Turkey's economic boom in the early 2000s, Arab Islamists in general, and Ennahda is one of them, they held court over declining states on the verge of bankruptcy. And Ennahda, having been there for 10 years, is seen as the reason behind the decline of the Tunisian economy and the rise of corruption, etc., etc. I mean, I'm not saying that Ennahda is the reason why this happened, but at least that's how it is seen by lots of Tunisians. The second problem, the rise of violent extremist groups. Violent extremist groups are themselves Islamist political movements, but with weapons. These groups became an attractive channel for many youths, and they challenged the mainstream political Islam that Ennahda was professing. Thousands of Tunisians joined these extremist groups, which means that their message, their offer was appealing to a large audience. And this audience is actually usually the audience that would go to Ennahda. So we saw, as years went by, we saw less and less Tunisians joining Ennahda, young Tunisians joining Ennahda. And here I move to the third issue, which is the broken image of political Islam and the adverse propaganda that it was facing in Tunisia. The broken image is partly linked to the rise of violent extremism. All these terrorist attacks that took place in the country, for many people, there was a link to Ennahda. And at least you can link that to how right-wing groups in Europe portray political Islam as one unity. You can link it also to how the previous regime in this country and this part of the world make political Islam one entity, and violent or non-violent, they put them together. And you can think also of the Saudi, Emirati, Egyptian propaganda that portrays ISIS and the Muslim Brotherhood as the same. So the image of political Islam was completely tarnished over the last few years in Tunisia. And the fourth issue, the last one, is what was considered for a while Ennahda's smartest move. And this is, I think Ennahda did this to escape the 3 pitfalls that I just mentioned, and they swapped ideology for pragmatism. But the result was not what the leaders of the party hoped for. So, Ennahda, in its early years, it was a revolutionary party, kind of a fundamentalist party, at least very conservative, but it gradually moved towards the center. In the 80s, in the 90s, in the 2000s, many of its leaders migrated to Europe, and they became socialized in Europe, and slowly many of them left the image or the model of Iran and its Islamic Republic and started talking about we are like the German Christian Democrats. And in 2011, when they came to power, Ennahda actually, even though in the first few weeks they were surfing with Salafists and other radical Islamists, but when they won the election, they either out of strategic passions or because they felt that they could not rule alone, they opted for consensus and started forging coalition with secular parties. And then, of course, in 2016, the party leader, Rashid Ghannouchi, announced that Ennahda had abandoned political Islam, don't call us Islamists anymore, and he emphasized the distinction between Ennahda's Muslim Democrats and political Islamists like the Muslim Brotherhood. So with time, they also lost their natural constituency by moving this far. And with all this, I think because they were in power for so long, or at least attached to the power for so long, they were used. So le pouvoir les a usés. Their time in power took a big toll on the party. And here, like what Dalia was saying about the MSP and MRN, Ennahda was seen as partly co-opted by the system by many Tunisian youth. And as I said in the beginning, unlike the AKP, they didn't really improve the economy. So that situation, that overall situation, the four problems that I mentioned, weakened Ennahda to the extent that we see it today. And because there is still no alternative or no well-organized political movement in the country, unlike 2011, when Ennahda was the only organized political movement in the country. Because of that vacuum, populist leaders like the current president, Qais Said, were able to find a space for themselves. And he knows that lots of people hate Ennahda, so he can move on and do what he's doing now. And very few people are willing to defend Ennahda. And I think we continue in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Youssef. I'm very mindful of the time, and I have been told to speed up. So I will try to speed up as much as I can without trying to lose the importance of the content of your answer. So I'll go back to the beginning, to Professor Wa, and we asked him about the reason kind of behind the failure. Now I'm going to ask him about the potential changes that Islamists have to make in order to become relevant again, because from what emerges, we have a picture of almost irrelevance, at least when it comes to the political system and political participations and elections and party politics. What can these parties do to become relevant again and legitimate again in the eyes of, if not the majority, at least a considerable amount of citizens?
So the big problem is that these parties wanted to be indispensable in the political arena, and now they realize that they are dispensable, that the government didn't necessarily need them. So can they survive in their present existing forms? I have some doubts, I think these parties are largely worn out, and that there are more and more some sort of empty framework with a decreasing constituency. But all depends on the new generation. And as for some leftist parties, like the Socialist Party in France, you cannot exclude that in the next 10 years, a new generation will take the power inside this empty shell and recreate a more modern, more efficient Islamic party. So I don't exclude that, but I am quite skeptical. So the stakes are with the new generation. And this new generation, as far as I know, as far as I can see, is less and less politicized. They have been disappointed by what did happen, including the Arab Spring, and now they are more on individual trajectories, trying to find a job, to migrate, etc., etc. So we have a lack of mobilization of the youth as a youth generation. But there are two points which would play a role. The first is the social and economic situation, of course, which is worsening everywhere. And we will certainly have some riots. So in Algeria, in Morocco, they can deal with riots. In Tunisia, it's far more complex because the security apparatus is weaker. But what do you do if you have an extension of riots, of social protest, and so on? So they might take a political form. Will they go back to Islamism? I have doubts. I don't know what will be the future political framework of mobilization in the Maghreb. But I think that the Islamist parties are worn out. They are part of the past. And the second contentious issue is about values. The government are using conservative traditional values in order to check the youth, to put pressure on the youth and so on. How long will it last? I agree that there are a lot of Salafi movement at the grassroots levels, but you have also a part of the youth which wants more freedom, not necessarily political freedom, but freedom of the way of life, sexual freedom, etc. So there is a potential of confrontation. I don't think that the Salafis will go to politics. So for the next period, I think things will be played inside the civil society. And in fact, the regimes are quite happy about that. They think that as long as they control the political field, it's okay, that they can manage riots, protests, and so on. So I'm not so sure. So I think we'll have a crisis, not necessarily not a revolution or things like that, but more and more tensions, more and more riots, and more discontent.
Thank you very much. Not the most optimistic of outlooks, but a very realistic one, most likely. I would like to broaden out for a moment from North Africa to the surrounding areas, and notably the Sahel, where Islamism has also been making inroads in all its different forms, whether in civil society or in party politics or through violence. And take the opportunity that we have Intisar here. She has an expertise on the Sahel as well. So Intisar, over to you for a couple of minutes. If you can maybe say whether you see similarities between the challenges and the problems that North Africa faces and the ones that are now that now sub-Saharan countries in the Sahel are facing. And if you can give us maybe your thoughts on that and the role of Islam and Islamism in all of this.
Yeah, so I think maybe the best way for me to approach this question is through a comparative lens and sort of looking at parallels between North Africa and the Sahel, if any. And I think, in the Sahelian political landscape, while there are ties between politics, religion, and society, of course, strong and fluid ties, they're sometimes difficult to characterize. But sort of a distinction here that I would make is that there aren't Islamist parties, except for Mauritania, the way that they exist and function in North African countries. There are several sort of different interpretations as to why this is. And some of the ones that I find satisfying really, kind of talk about the evolution of demographics and political trends. So in terms of political trends, the difference for Sahel countries is that Islamist parties did not develop in the sense that kind of a moderate, non-clerical led group dominated by intellectuals, with the same sort of bureaucratic structure, the way that Islamist parties did in North Africa. They did not have the same experience in the Sahel that they did in North Africa in the 70s and 80s as essentially bulwarks used by the state to curb the appeal of leftist ideologies. So in that sense, this kind of organized groups did not have the same experience through which they could develop the institutional, organizational, and even actual experience that kind of became part of the appeal that Islamist parties developed in places like Morocco and Tunisia, for example. Another example, as I mentioned, another element I should say that I mentioned is demographics, social and economic development, particularly of the population. The base of Islamist parties, if you see, at least in North Africa, tends to be widest among the educated urban middle class groups. These groups are relatively smaller in Sahel countries. And I think there is another factor here that could have a little bit of an impact, is that there is more religious diversity in some of the Sahelian countries like Burkina Faso and Chad. There are Christian communities and so forth. But there is also, I think, a more powerful argument to be made, is that the sort of Islamic structures that we see in the Sahel, they are enmeshed in tribal structures that are potentially more powerful than the religious ones. So again, this context did not kind of favor or lead to the emergence of Islamist parties as such. But of course, as you mentioned, there are powerful clerics and groups with strong mobilization power in Sahelian societies who do influence public life and policies and politics, but not in a way through sort of a religiously inclined political party that then competes in the election and hold office in that sense. There are other actors, of course, also that vie for power, including in the name of religion, of course, including extremist groups. And that tends to kind of dominate the debate about religion and security, political trends in the region. And of course, and maybe more important, is the way that the West engages with the Sahel. Just very briefly on Islamic militant group violence, it's been growing at a rapid pace, particularly since 2017. In terms of the underlying causes, of course, there is a range here. We can talk about weak states, weak or non-existent service delivery, out-group grievances, government-perpetrated violence. There are other elements, of course, that play a role, such as climate change, which then threatens the livelihood of groups and impacts ties among community and can culminate into communal violence. This is sort of the unfortunate confluence of circumstances that make stability in the Sahel more elusive. And this is sort of what contributes, again, to the more complicated context of the rise of coups in the region as well. Just, kind of in terms of the future of political Islam there, I'm not sure to what extent these elements that I mentioned need to change in order for Islamist parties to emerge in the same way that they did in North Africa. And more importantly, this sort of presupposes that these actors in the Sahel want to have the same experience as in North Africa, which I'm not sure that that's the case. I mean, one of the best sort of characterization of how, religious actors sort of the kind of role that they want to have vis-a-vis the state is that they want to shape the state, but not necessarily be directly involved in running it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Intisar. This leads me back in a way to Dalia's point, and that's where I'm going to go next, because there's this idea that we can move away from political parties, in fact, to understand Islamism more broadly, and we can see what is happening in broader society, and more specifically, usually we have the tendency to think of political Islam or Islamism in general using women as the terrain of great social conflict and confrontation with other ideologies, other groups, and so Dalia was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about that, not necessarily only the case of Algeria, but the case of the region as a whole, this relationship between Islamism, gender issues, what political parties have done, and versus what is actually happening in society, where Islamists are still the protagonists in many ways of activism.
Yeah, sure. I think what's important here, to note, and I will paraphrase Professor Roy in one of his articles that was published in 1999 called Post-Islamism, is that there is a reformulation of Islamism. The Islamists have understood in a way and internalized the idea that for a variety of reasons, the establishment of an Islamic state is not possible, being in Algeria or elsewhere. Look at what happened, for instance, in Egypt. Today, the Islamists in Egypt are like stuck. They are stuck. They are in statu quo. They do know that under Sisi things are not going to be possible for them. So they are just waiting. But again, so they internalized, this idea, the establishment of the Islamic State is not possible. And, they internalized what Professor Roy called, the political impasse. With that, they changed their discourse in general, and the one on women in particular, moderate Islamists in Algeria, such as those of the Islamist party, the MSP, among others, have abandoned that idea, and they talk about women as being, political, but also economic actors. They also, pushed for them to be more present in the political arena, but they remain, their project, even though it's not political, I think their project is highly societal today. So they place themselves as the guardians of morality. In 2015, for instance, the Islamists of the coalition AAV in Algeria tried to block from passing a bill that criminalized violence against women. And one of the MSP members said back then, Mohammed Dawi explained that women were responsible for the violence against them because of their attire and their makeup. The bill, fortunately, was adopted on March 5th, 2015. Also, while it is true that the Islamists have had women candidates, it is also true that in all these countries, being in Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, or even Libya, women remain marginalized from political networks in clientelist, settings. The gender gap has been reduced in parliament also, thanks to quota, and Algeria was in 2012, the country in the MENA region with the highest rate of women in parliament, among them Islamist women. But in the latest election, the parliament began again to be dominated by men. Only 34 women in the 2020 parliamentary election entered parliament. So again, but despite that, what is important to note is that the Islamists are targeting society in general and women in particular. Of course, I made this fieldwork in Algeria in 2019 about the education in private school run by Dawah Salafiyya, and it was very important to see how little girls were treated and how the indoctrination started at a very, very early age. So they do understand that they cannot, just, dismiss half of humanity, half of the population. And so they are using them also to reach their political agenda. And I will end on that to leave some space for Youssef, for Tunisia. But I think, what is very important in the case, at least of Algeria, and as I said it, they might have a decline in the political arena at the political level, but again, at the societal level, they are becoming, and they are strong. The Dawah Salafiyya is integrating political observation into its religious instruction, which shows that politics directly affects spiritual life on some level. They are actually guiding millions of Algerians in their daily life on their daily observance. And so I would say, that through the activities, including the educational activities that they do, they have a strong stance on culture, on religion. And, by doing so, they are very smart because they avoid the wrath of the authorities. And on the other hand, they are putting in place the foundation and the pillars for building an Islamic society according to its Salafi standards. And as Albani said it once in his precept, build an Islamic state in your heart, it shall be built for you on your lands. And this is, I think, their long game. These people are not, thinking in the same time as us. They are thinking about the long game. And I do believe that we will have this conversation in 10, 15 years, and it will be pretty the same, but a little bit different for, the challenges and for, what kind of objective they reached.
Thank you very much, Dalia. This actually fits quite well with the last question that I want to ask Youssef about Tunisia, but more broadly, possibly about this idea that in fact there's multiple facets to Islamism, and that focusing on parties might not tell us the whole story. It doesn't tell us the whole story about Algeria. Maybe it doesn't tell us the whole story about Tunisia and other Arab countries as well. So the idea is that maybe in fact this kind of intra-movement competition or inter-movements competition between Islamists of different stripes can actually, I don't want to say lead to a revival, but certainly can explain why it seems to survive, with changes and so on, because in fact it has many different manifestations. And the idea, therefore, is that maybe intra-movement and inter-movement rivalries can help it sustain and change and survive even in these challenging times.
Thank you, Francesco. In the case of Tunisia now, for instance, there is an intra-fight inside the Ennahda between different groups, but one cannot really categorize them as following different visions or different ideologies. We don't see a classical scheme of the younger revolutionaries fighting against the older bureaucrats inside the party. But my point would be slightly different because, yes, we're talking today about this. Some people are talking about the end of political Islam and the end of political Islamists in the region. But I think what remains is the political use of Islam. And that's when we look at that, then it's different. Because if we're thinking only about political Islam as Muslim Brotherhood and Ennahda and these parties, well, I think they are being used. And Professor Roy mentioned earlier the Parti Socialiste in France. I mean, look at the Parti Socialiste today. As a party, it's very weak and very small. And many, the communist parties across the world became something almost negligible. And I think that's what is happening now to the parties of political Islam. But the use of Islam, I think, is something that will continue. And again, looking at Tunisia today, the most secular opponents of, not the most, but some of the secular opponents of Ennahda, like President Kais Saied or the Parti des Syriens Libres, they never criticize Islam. And they even use Islam to strike against Ennahda. So the use of Islam in politics will continue. And we may see new movements arising, maybe from, what you mentioned, through these clashes inside the different Islamist movements. But they will continue to be around. And but not as political Islam, but as other players using Islam in politics.
Thank you very much, Youssef. I think we have, 3 minutes for the questions from the audience. That's not too bad, given that we already have 4 questions, and by the time I read them, the time will be up. So I'm going to pick and choose. I'm going to go back to Youssef very quickly, because there's a question that is specifically for Tunisia. And the question basically is asking, is the large majority of Tunisians really against the use of religion for political ends, because there's talk of rewriting the Tunisian constitution and eliminating Islam from actually even being mentioned in the constitution? Or is this a bit more complex than that?
Yeah. Well, this is exactly what I was saying. Actually, no. Of course, there are things that are linked to political Islam that are being abandoned, and sometimes we hear these buzzing news like we will delete Islam from the constitution, but in fact there are lots of conservative views inside this constitution, and there is a very important conservative book of laws in the country that are linked in a way or the other to Islam, and I don't think they will disappear from a day to the other. And I think it's dangerous to see the current trend as Tunisians or Arabs in general really going towards full secularism. And we see that often in Egypt, for instance, that, look, they're abandoning political Islam and they're moving towards this very secular republic. But in fact, no, the majority of Egyptians or Tunisians, they are still very much into Islam. I mean, and even if you think of Sisi, he himself is not deep inside. He's not that very secular individual. But again, these regimes, they like to portray themselves, especially to the Western community, as secular champions. But in fact, they are maybe slightly secular. They are definitely against political Islam as a political movement, but you can't count on them to separate Islam from society a la European way.
Thank you very much, Youssef. This leads me really well to another question that has been asked by the audience, and that I would ask Intisar, Dalia, and Olivier to give maybe a very brief answer to this one. I think all the three of you have something to contribute to this. The question is about to what extent the notion of civil state then play a role these days. This idea of, the distinction between separating religion from the state versus separating religion from politics, which are quite different types of separation. So maybe we can go Intisar, Olivier, Dalia, a word on the idea of the civil state and if it's making inroads, and if so, in what kind of ways it is doing so.
Let me think a little bit about how to sort of tackle this question. I would say that I agree with what Youssef said. If you ask the population, do you want your regime, your life, your party, the structure that you live in to have nothing to do with religion? I don't think it's, certainly I don't think that there is going to be any headway for that. But I will go back to a point that I made in closing my first question, which is that, I think people, when it comes to how the government functions, when it comes to how sort of local institutions and kind of, immediate officials as such, how they function, I think it's becoming, and I would argue that this has probably been the case for a long time, but we are maybe paying more and more attention to it. It's becoming more about the efficiency. How can you deliver effectively? It doesn't matter what at least from what I see when I talk to people, it doesn't matter what your sort of religious credentials are. If you are able to deliver, better health institutions, better education, better, et cetera, then I think that's sort of where all of the energy is going. And that kind of goes back to the point that Dalia has been making, which is the appeal of the Salafi community and the appeal of kind of these communities that say, let us see what we can provide for you in terms of services. And then with that, of course, there's also a transmission of ideology and such. I mean, it's not, I don't think it's that people kind of go into that consciously saying, I want to become a sort of a Salafi because this is what aligns with my ideology and such. And if they do, I would argue that that's maybe a small percentage of that. I think it's really more about who offers the best opportunity for education, who offers the best opportunity for material well-being, as I said. But also, I think there's an element to that is who is going to listen to me and value my input and kind of take what I have to say, seriously and kind of extrapolate from that to give me a kind of a well-representative system. Because as I was hearing Dalia talk about Salafism and kind of the appeal that they're making in society, there are some parallels also in Morocco. There are Salafi groups that are kind of, they don't automatically say, we are here because we want to have a direct role in governing the country because we want to be political parties and such. We're here because we want to make sure that people are well taken care of. We want to educate girls. We want to provide for a society that is efficient, that is well educated, that is conscious, and that is also pious. And it's very difficult to argue against piety. How do you say? Yeah, so I think on those bases, that's sort of where a lot of the appeal goes. I know this doesn't directly answer the question, but that goes to explain how complex these sort of choices are for the population. And I'm happy to let others weigh in as well.
Olivier, if you want to give your contribution to this, or maybe add on to what Intisar has said.
I agree. I think the issue now is not what is in the constitution. I think the people are a bit fed up about that. And they understood that the issue is not that the first article says something about Islam. The issue is are the concrete laws which are passed by the regime of the parliament. You can have anti-feminist laws without any reference to Islam, So I think the people are disappointed with this debate on Islam, and they are more polarized on concrete issues, laws, of course, but also everyday life.
Thank you very much. Dalia, to you, the last word on
I couldn't agree more with my colleagues. I think people are worried also about what they can put on the table of the food that they can bring to their families. COVID-19 has been horrible for some countries in the region. Of course, some countries such as Morocco handled the situation better than other countries like Algeria and Tunisia. And I think the upcoming years are going to be very difficult for the region. Of course, I don't know who said this, but some countries are more, prepared than others, especially in terms of coercive, measures. And bottom line, I think above all, Islam has a very important, place in the cultural life of these population. And I think individual piety is also a collective story in this region. Whether people are welcoming or eager, to accept the idea of civil state, at least, in Algeria, I don't see this coming. Even the slogan is there, but I don't see them doing it for many reasons that we don't have the time to develop here. But bottom line, I think, a public sphere, that is open and diversified, welcoming all kind of people, we are still far from this in Algeria.
Thank you very much. I think this concludes our discussion for today. We only have 6 minutes after 12, so we did reasonably well, I think. So thanks to me, the moderator, of course.
I was going to say that. I was going to say thank you for your great job.
So thank you very much again to the audience. First of all, thank you very much to ISPI again for organizing this. Thank you very much, Youssef, Intisar, Olivier, and Dalia for your invaluable contribution to what has been a fascinating discussion about political Islam in North Africa. And I will say goodbye to everyone and thanks again.